A huge blow to Diddy's defense team just 3 months before his high-profile trial is expected to start. On Friday, a surprising announcement came down. One of his defense attorneys suddenly quits the case. Now, this particular defense attorney's reason for quitting wasn't really a reason at all, making his departure a lot more puzzling. Shortly after Diddy's arrest, his defense team grew when he stacked on 2 more defense attorneys to join Mark Agnifilo and Tinny Garagos at the defense table. Now, the 2 that joined at the time were high-profile attorney Alexandra Shapiro, whose client Sam Bankman-Fried actually shared a unit at the detention center with Diddy, and high-profile death penalty attorney Anthony Rico. Now, while the pair joined around the same time, Anthony in a court filing on Friday said he's leaving the case. In the filing, Anthony Rico said, quote, "For the reasons set forth below, this motion for withdrawals is filed so that Sean Combs may move forward with his defense and to commence jury selection and trial without any delay. As a result of discussion with lead counsel Mark Agnifilo, this motion for withdrawal of counsel is filed. While I am aware that the local rule requires an application for withdrawal of counsel is supported and granted, there are sufficient reasons related to protections afforded by the attorney-client privilege for brevity in my application for withdrawal as counsel in this case. Although I have provided Sean Combs with the high level of legal representation expected by the court, under no circumstances can I continue to effectively serve as counsel for Sean Combs," end quote. Now, essentially in legalese, I quit, but I can't go into details because of attorney-client privilege. According to the filing, though, the defense shakeup won't delay the case. Diddy will continue with 5 attorneys. That's Mark Agnifilo, Tinny Garagos, Alexandra Shapiro, Jason A. Driscoll, and Anna Esteval. Now, a judge still has to sign off on the motion, but with the government taking no position on it and the fact Anthony Rico spoke with Mark Agnifilo about it before filing the motion, a judge will likely sign off on it. Now, as I mentioned, Anthony Rico is a very well-established death penalty attorney and was lead defense in up to 45 federal death penalty cases. His bio on the Fordham Law University website says some of the notable yet controversial cases included Anthony Rico serving on the counsel in the World Trade bombing conspiracy case and embassy bombing in 1998. And he stays busy. He also doubles as an adjunct professor of law at Fordham and has been practicing law since 1982. As for Diddy himself, as many of us know, he's been locked up on charges of federal sex trafficking, racketeering conspiracy, and transportation to engage in prostitution. Now, that last charge I mentioned, i.e. count 3 in his indictment, transportation to engage in prostitution, well, Diddy's lawyers are wanting that charge thrown out, citing it's from a racist law. Just days before Anthony Rico filed a motion to withdraw from Diddy's counsel, Diddy's lawyers filed a motion to dismiss that charge because they argue no white person has ever been the target of a remotely similar prosecution. So that charge is known as the Mann Act, which was previously named by Congress as the White Slave Traffic Act, which made it illegal to transport people across state or international lines for the purpose of prostitution. Here's the thing. Diddy's lawyer says the law has a history of racial bias. Diddy's defense seems to be gearing up toward his alleged criminal conduct wasn't criminal. It was his personal business of what was going on in his bedrooms or hotels or wherever the freak-offs occurred. So they're saying that count 3 wasn't transportation to engage in prostitution, but was just him using escorts, male escorts at that, to bring in as a third with his girlfriends. Whereas the government's theory of the case is Diddy used force, fraud, and coercion to make his alleged victims have sex against their will in his freak-offs that he recorded for his own pleasure. Now, Diddy pleaded not guilty to all his charges, hence why the case is going to trial. And that trial is set for less than 3 months from now, in early May. Now, despite being locked up for 5 months, Diddy's case continues to make headlines, not just from the federal trial, but also the dozens of civil lawsuits he still faces. But Diddy scored some wins behind bars. One of his civil lawsuits accusing him of raping a 13-year-old with Jay-Z back in 2000 was dismissed after the accuser dropped her lawsuit against the 2 moguls. Now, both vehemently denied the allegation, and Jay-Z, for his part, took it a step further and sued the accuser's attorney, Tony Busby, for extortion. However, despite that being dismissed, Diddy still faces a number of civil suits, even from accusers whose lawyer isn't Tony Busby. As for Diddy's federal criminal case, the stakes are high. He's facing a minimum of 15 years in prison, but a maximum of life behind bars. Let's break down the latest defense team shakeup with attorney and former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani. Nima, it's always great to see you, and thank you so much for joining me today. What's your reaction to Anthony Rico saying he's quitting the defense team, and how significant is it, being that Diddy's 3 months away from trial?
Elizabeth, it is significant, and it's tough to know the reason why. It could be any number of possibilities. Sometimes it's when the lawyer hasn't been paid, but we know obviously Diddy doesn't have that problem. He's got plenty of money. It could be a disagreement regarding defense strategy. It could be a conflict. It could be a health issue. It really could be anything. And the paperwork doesn't identify it, nor should it. And the fact that Mark Ignifilo is still on the case and the other counsel of record leads me to believe that the judge is going to rubber stamp this motion and grant it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was kind of surprised, like you were too, because even being inside the courtroom and throughout Diddy's hearings, you would see Diddy and Anthony kind of speaking to one another. He would always pass him notes while Mark Agnifilo made the arguments. Diddy and Anthony Rico would exchange hugs with one another. Anthony Rico always even made it a point to tell the judge Diddy's family traveled all the way from traveled all the way to New York for his hearings. With all that being said, kind of going back to what potentially the reasoning might be. Do you think that it might have been a personal conflict between Diddy and Anthony Rico, or do you think it might have been Anthony Rico with other counsel? But what do you make of all of that?
Potentially, it could be a conflict with the client, right? A disagreement. They just don't get along. The communication is poor. They don't agree on defense strategy. It could be a conflict with one of the other lawyers. Obviously, seems like Agnifilo is the lead on this case, although Rico was certainly, yeah, his 1B. And I know obviously there's other lawyers on the case. Obviously, a lot of the victims are female. They're going to want female lawyers on the defense team, especially during some of the aggressive cross examination. That tends to be the conventional wisdom when you're dealing with victims who are alleged victims of sexual assault or abuse. And then it could be a conflict with one of the victims themselves. Maybe Agnifilo, excuse me, maybe Rico consulted with them or even represented them in such a way that he has to get off the case. So it could be any number of potential conflicts.
Absolutely. And yeah, kind of just looking at the motion to withdraw too, like you had mentioned before, not much reasoning given. Anthony Rico wrote there are sufficient reasons related to the protections afforded by attorney-client privilege for brevity in my application for withdrawal as counsel in this case. Although I've provided Sean Combs with the high level of legal representation expected by the court, under no circumstances can I continue to effectively serve as counsel. Five other attorneys will remain on record. What do you make of just that? It felt like he was saying a lot, but then not at all much at the same time.
Well, when you withdraw, really, still need to protect the client and the confidences. So you don't want to say something that may jeopardize him or the case. And you also need leave or permission of the judge. So you want to provide enough so the judge knows that you're not leaving the client high and dry, but you don't want to provide too much that may compromise defense strategy or a weakness in the case or some other issue that would hurt the client. So it is a delicate balancing test. Again, when you have so many others still on the case, I don't expect there to be an issue here.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I know we've spoken a number of times about the terms of Diddy's defense strategy and what it kind of feels like possibly once trial comes. And it seems like they're kind of going for there was no force, there was no fraud, there was no coercion, that the freak offs were consensual, there was no sex trafficking. Do you think they have something else up their sleeve, or do you think that the defense will kind of remain going forward that, all of this alleged bad acts were consensual and it was just a relationship between two parties? It ended sourly, but yet they, brought in escorts, and that kind of speaks to a little bit of that transportation to engage in prostitution charge. But what do you just make of the defense strategy that we've been seeing so far right now?
I think it has to be the defense, the consent, because look, sometimes you can argue that the sexual activity never happened, right? It wasn't me, defense. But this is not your typical sexual assault case. There are a lot of people there, right? There are people that are arranging the sex workers. There are people that are setting up lights and cameras, booking hotel rooms. Obviously, Diddy has a large entourage. So there's a lot of witnesses there, and a lot of this was allegedly recorded. So I think it's going to be very difficult to argue that it wasn't me. So you have to argue that it was consensual. And we've talked about the line that separates sex trafficking from consensual sex, that force, fraud, or coercion. So I fully expect the defense to be this was all consensual. These are all people who are trying to shake Diddy down for money. This is all extortion. That's why they're pursuing these claims. They're just piling on. But really, this is regret, not rape. And I think that's the defense strategy in this case.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you about a motion that was actually filed earlier this week, too, where Diddy's defense wants to dismiss count three of the indictment, that being transportation to engage in prostitution. They cite that the Mann Act is racist and that Diddy has been singled out because he's a powerful black man and he's being prosecuted for conduct that regularly goes unpunished. What do you make of that argument?
Those are very difficult motions to win. So it's essentially a selective prosecution motion. And the example I always like to give is, let's say you're speeding and a police officer pulls you over. It's not a legal defense to say, well, all these other people were speeding, but you didn't pull them over and ticket them. You have to show that the prosecution is for a constitutionally prohibited reason. Obviously, race being one of them. If the unlikely chance the defense can prove that this was a racially motivated prosecution, that would have a chance of success. Obviously, that's going to be very difficult because there are a lot of victims. I believe that a lot of the victims were also black victims, men and women. So it's going to be tough to make that argument. But that's why defense attorneys do what they do. Sometimes they throw these Hail Mary motions up there, hoping that maybe something will stick. If not at the trial court, maybe on appeal.
And you mentioned that a Hail Mary. Why do you think that they waited until a few months before the trial set to begin to file that motion, given that count three has been on the indictment since September?
Sometimes you brainstorm, you talk with different appellate lawyers, because when you're defending a case like this, you're not just thinking about the trial court. You're thinking, okay, well, if Combs is convicted, what are the chances on appeal, both to the Second Circuit, which is the Court of Appeal there, and then potentially the Supreme Court? What arguments can we make? Creative arguments. So sometimes the appellate lawyers will come in, and oftentimes they aren't the folks that have anything to do with trying the case. You got your trial lawyers, you got your appellate lawyers. So maybe they come in, they say, hey, I want this motion filed, because if you don't make the motion in the trial court, usually you waive it on appeal unless it's some clear error that the judge made. So you got to make these motions if you're the defense, if you want to have these same arguments if Combs is convicted.
Yeah, and then of course Alexandra Shapiro being on Diddy's defense team, a very high profile, high powered appellate lawyer as well as attorney too. And even for you, Nima, as a former federal prosecutor, I asked you before what the defense might have up their sleeve, but what do you think the government may have up their sleeve come trial? And do you think that they have a strong enough case as we have it right now?
I do think they have a strong enough case. Obviously, if you're the prosecution and you're the government, you love the video evidence, not because it's lurid and cringeworthy, but your video doesn't lie. So when I have video evidence, I say, well, look, witnesses can lie, victims can lie, defendants certainly lie all the time, but that video doesn't lie. So I love the video evidence. Now, there are reportedly, 100 plus folks who have filed civil lawsuits. You're certainly not going to call all of them. But if I'm the government, I really want to call my best victims. And by best, I mean the ones that are going to be the best witnesses. So obviously, we know Cassie Ventura is one of them. She's going to be the star witness in this case. But there's a superseding indictment. They talk about a couple other victims, some of the physical and sexual violence. So right now, what I'm doing is I'm sort of sorting through and saying, okay, well, I don't want to rely just on one victim, but maybe I want three, maybe I want five. Somewhere certainly less than 10. You're not going to parade all these victims there. It's cumulative, and it could potentially, you might lose the jury. So you're going to probably pick anywhere from your best 3 to 10 victims, certainly not more than that. Make sure that they're prepared on the stand, because the cross-examination is going to be very aggressive. This is a defense case that's pretty much going to be based on cross-examining the victims and saying that Cassie was upset because they had broken up and this was a lover's dispute. It wasn't rape or sex trafficking. So that the cross-examination is going to be strong. You want to make sure those victims are prepared.
Absolutely. And of course, the news coming down just this week that Cassie is pregnant with her third child. What do you think that could look like in front of a jury? You have Diddy's defense team probably coming out with that very strong, very aggressive cross-examination. And, come her time to testify, she could be months pregnant. What do you think that could really look like and how that could translate in front of a jury? I feel like they would have to be pretty delicate there.
No question. And it's not good news for the defense. Everyone loves a pregnant woman. So when you have a pregnant woman on the witness stand testifying, already there has to be some sensitivity. And that's why, oftentimes, we talked about it at the top, that you'll have females who cross-examine females who are making these types of accusations. Obviously, a recent famous case was Camille Vasquez cross-examining Amber Heard. You sometimes it can be overbearing just from a perception perspective when you have a man cross-examining a female victim, and then now you have a pregnant female victim. So I would expect that cross-examination to be done by a female lawyer.
Yeah, absolutely. Nima Rahmani, always great to have you on. Always love your insight. I really appreciate it. Before we sign you off, though, my final question to you is Diddy is a name that makes headlines across the nation, internationally, especially here in New York, too. What do you think, or excuse me, do you think that Diddy can get a fair trial come jury selection?
I think it can, and I think technology has really changed everything. Maybe decades ago, before Law and Crime, you'd have these cases that got a lot of local attention, but now everyone in the world knows who Diddy is. Doesn't matter whether in New York or L.A. or Miami, where he had homes, where some of this activity allegedly happened. Everyone knows who Diddy is. So there's no moving the trial to some other city that folks don't have some sort of preconceived notion about this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I remember just during one of his first hearings, there was a tourist coming from Germany and she even knew who Diddy was. So it'll be interesting to see how this all unfolds come May. Nima, again, thank you so much for your time and your insight. I always appreciate it.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Again, Sean Diddy Combs pleaded not guilty to his charges and denies all the allegations made in the various civil lawsuits he still faces. Now the countdown begins for his high-profile trial, which is expected to start on May 5th.